On today's episode of Uncommon Sense, I speak about the newest doctor of the church, Saint John Henry Cardinal Newman, how Chesterton can help us understand him, and vice versa. Hello, viewers and listeners. Welcome to another episode of Uncommon Sense. My name is Joe Grabowski, the VP of Evangelization here at the Society of G.K. Chesterton. And coming to you again solo today with just a quick episode reflecting on the recent event of St. John Henry Cardinal Newman being named a Doctor of the Church, formally by Pope Leo XIV. That happened on the Solemnity of All Saints, Saturday, November 1st. And I'm sure that many of us are familiar with John Henry Cardinal Newman, or at least his name. He's been kind of a rising star, let us say. This is a very quick turnaround, considering the timeline of the beatification and then the canonization of this man as a saint, and already his being proclaimed a doctor of the church. For those unfamiliar, you should know that doctors of the church are not common, despite the fact that some estimates say there are as many as 10,000 canonized saints, those both officially canonized or those that are sometimes called pre-congregation saints, the saints that were proclaimed sort of by popular acclamation. Think of some of the early martyrs and folks like that. Despite there being that many, there are only 38 doctors of the church. So this is a rare honor amongst the communion of saints, and yet in Newman's case, one very well deserved, I think, and I think we have a lot to learn from him. He's particularly important to Anglo-sphere Catholicism, those in the English-speaking world. He really is now among the doctors of the church, the sole, Anglophone doctor of the church. He wrote almost solely in English. He would have written probably a little bit of Latin and Greek, as one did back then. I'm sure he might have had correspondences that he kept perhaps in French and German, as was kind of the habit of some of the educated class, but and also probably Italian when he started dealing with the Romans. But Newman is very much an Englishman. He's a man of Oxford. He's a scholar from England. And for those that don't know the trajectory of his life, you can read his autobiography named Apologia Pro Vita Sua, that was published in the 1860s. Newman is very much a man of the 19th century. He lives really throughout that entire century and dies rather an old man, but his impact is significant. He's affiliated with, or really one of the progenitors of, and the late leader of the Tractarian movement, or the Oxford movement, as it is sometimes called. We can't get into a lot of the history of his life and the impact that he had at the time. It's difficult, though, to try to think of a modern day parallel to this. I suppose you could maybe think of the attention that is given to a figure like, say, Jordan Peterson. Regardless of your views on Dr. Peterson and his thoughts, I know that I have my opinions as to some of the things that he does with scriptural interpretation and his Jungian approach to psychology, for example. But regardless of all of that, you have to admit that he's a significant public intellectual, and in his capacity as a public intellectual, he is somebody that attracts a lot of interest from believers and non-believers alike. And as such, given his dealing with matters of faith in some of his lectures, his series that he does studying the scriptures and looking at the scriptures as sort of these archetypal, again, Jungian stories, Jungian typology, and so forth, he attracts a lot of interest from religious believers. And his religious journey is something happening very much in the public square. That would be something like an analogy to Newman. And yet even that doesn't quite capture the way that this guy was really much in the public mind of England. You have to realize that during the Victorian era, in a way that, before the various crises of the 20th century, from the Great War to the sexual revolution, and even before both of those things, the late industrial revolution and so forth, there have been a lot of forces that kind of broke down the faith in the Western world, the institutional relevancy, let's say, of faith in the Western world, kind of, you know, in this is sort of how we refer to modernity or postmodernity. This is one of its signal things. That was not quite the case yet in the Victorian era. While you did have some avowed rationalists, agnostics, deists, people like that who are being influenced by late Enlightenment thinking, by thinkers like Voltaire out of France, etc. Nevertheless, in England, it was very much still a Christian country, avowedly. Victoria, as queen, is still very much relevant to the identity of the nation, to the values of the nation, and we can think a lot of just what we know of these Victorian stereotypes. We could read figures like Dickens, that Chesterton so loved, and get a sense of this being really a society of manners and of mores. Uh, and it's that former thing, that manners issue, that is very much part of Newman's journey, because Newman is struggling with questions of dogma, of doctrine, of the identity of the church. What is the church that Jesus Christ founded? And he's doing it very much in public. And in addition to sort of the theological question involved there, there's a lot of just manners in society that get tied up in this question of what is right and what is proper, and how to conduct this conversation in public. Really, what spurs him to write the Apologia Pro Vita Sua, his autobiography, and you can see from the title there, apology, it's an apologia, or a defense, so you have to think in terms of apologetics to get the sense of that title. He's writing it because he was sort of challenged and really libeled by some of his fellow countrymen who said that he was duplicitous, that he had changed, that he had avowedly professed one religious belief system, but all the while he was sort of a secret crypto-Catholic. He was moving towards Rome this whole time. And so he comes under a lot of fire from people, and he writes this. He was no he was no shrinking violet. He would not back down from a conflict. And so he decides to enter into public controversy about this. There's even libel proceedings, court proceedings, that he eventually gets involved in at some point, or at least has to swear affidavits as to, whether or not he was libelous of other people in the back and forth of public correspondence, or they of him. And he just tries to, at every turn, set the record straight. He's really trying, ironically, for as much as he's accused of being duplicitous, Newman is constantly trying to be transparent in a very kind of fascinating and unique way. We have this great tradition of great faith biographies or autobiographies, and one thinks quintessentially of the Confessions of Saint Augustine, for example. Then one might think of, let's say, the autobiography of Saint Teresa of Avila, or then the story of a soul written by the later Saint Teresa, Teresa of Lisieux, who we've spoken about on this podcast before. Newman's biography very much is of that tradition, of this tradition of a great faith autobiography, and trying to set his sentiments, his religious sentiments, down on paper to justify himself before others, to say that he wasn't duplicitous, that he was growing in his opinions, he was evolving in his thought, and just trying to pursue the truth where it leads. This pursuit on Newman's part leads to a lot of the great quotations that we have from him, some of which are taken out of context and some of which we'll have time to reflect upon today. But as I said in the opening, I want to, in this brief podcast, just kind of cover a little bit of Newman's sort of essential thought and his writings, and kind of where I see an overlap with Chesterton, where I see a little bit of uh, distinguishing elements from Chesterton, and how these two thinkers can be used to kind of cast light upon one another. And I think sometimes we interpret it a little too facilely. Some people will say, for example, just that Newman was a big influence on Chesterton. For example, uh, sure, fair enough. It's sort of like saying though that Dante is a big influence on uh, Francis Thompson or anybody writing after Dante. Let's say Newman is this paramount, this huge towering figure, especially in the English context. You have to remember when Newman converts to Catholicism, he's a professor at Oxford. Or a fellow at Oxford, he has to resign, from his fellowship. He has to resign his care of a church in the Anglican Church. He has to basically leave everything, give up his whole livelihood. Part of that because you had to swear to the 39 Articles. You had to be a confessing conformist to participate in sort of the higher echelons of society in institutions like Oxford. I can't remember exactly off the top of my head the date of Catholic emancipation, but uh, it was not even legal for a long time in England for Catholics to participate in Parliament or in politics formally. Um, Even by the time of Chesterton and Belloc, when Belloc runs for Parliament, he is derided by some of his would-be constituents for the fact that he is a Romanist, a papist. There's a lot of distrust, all the more so back in Newman's day. So, does Newman sort of set a tone for religious discourse between Anglicanism and Catholicism and Protestantism? And notice that I refer to three things there that will be important as we move forward in this discussion. Does he set that tone in such a way that it's still kind of resonant and relevant at the time of Chesterton and Belloc? Sure, certainly. On the other hand, I think that, you need the devil's in the details. Simply to say that, Newman is an influence upon Chesterton, I think does not enough justice to either thinker. We have to really explore where indeed he is an influence, where Chesterton is maybe otherwise influenced by figures who are maybe not of a Newmanian bent. So that's kind of what I want to get into on this episode today. So very quickly to cover the major works, if you're interested in kind of reading more about this and learning more of who Newman is, because again, he is this doctor of the church now. And on the one hand, that means he's very accessible to us because it's, as I said, the first doctor of the church who's writing all of his theological work in English, in the English language. And he's a master prose stylist of the English language. James Joyce famously said, and I know Bishop Barron likes to quote this, that someone came up to Joyce and said they wanted to shake the hand of the greatest master of the English language. And Joyce said, no, the greatest master of the English language is a cardinal of the Roman Church. And he meant Cardinal Newman. Newman's prose is wonderful. It is beautiful. It is very much, though, of its time. I see a lot of similarities personally between Newman and Ruskin. They never met a subordinate clause that they didn't like. Their paragraphs will go on for pages at a time, and we, especially in kind of used to the staccato rhythms of modern prose, as pioneered by figures like Hemingway and Fitzgerald, and indeed Joyce in some of his writings. In other writings, he didn't even write sentences, and the ones that he did were interminable. But um, it's a challenge for us sometimes to get into the prosody of Newman. However, if you have an appreciation for that, if you're willing to struggle through it, I think that you will see a lot of beauty in the style there. Um, his major works, I mean, we could spend all day just listing his bibliography and explaining what they are, but for my money, I would point out four works in particular that you might want to familiarize yourself if you want to dip your toe in the pond. The first and arguably the most accessible is that Apologia Pro Vita Sua, the 1864-65 autobiography of Cardinal Newman. Even in that, you're going to encounter, this is our first contact point with Chesterton, you're going to encounter a similarity to reading Chesterton in that he's writing for his time and he's name dropping and calling out other people with whom he is interacting intellectually without a mind to posterity per se. I think Newman, similar to Chesterton, had a kind of humility. I would argue that Newman knew more, that he was a significant figure on the intellectual stage. Chesterton was even less self-aware of his kind of importance as a thinker and the way that he would be taken by posterity. Newman knew enough to save his correspondences and to compile his letters and things. He knew that there would be an interest in reading lots of what he had to say. But what is similar to Chesterton is that he writes primarily for his audience and for his interlocutors in the intellectual dialectic that's going on at the time. And so he's not necessarily paying attention to explaining who this contemporary figure is, Kingsley or Keble or whoever it happens to be. He's not doing that. Just as Chesterton, when he writes about Shaw or Blatchford or Wells or Dean Inge, you don't get you don't get kind of an explanation of who the person is. And yet, just like with Chesterton, you keep reading the page and you get a sense of the type of person. You get the gist of the argument that is being made, regardless of your knowledge of the historical facts. So this is a similarity in the contemporaneousness of the writing of both Newman and Chesterton. And so if you can get through Chesterton and you're able to read, a book like Orthodoxy or the Catholic Church and Conversion or his autobiography or What's Wrong with the World, and you're not distracted by these references to figures like George Bernard Shaw, you don't feel the need to go look up who that person was on Wikipedia, I think you're going to be as successful reading the Apologia Pro Vita Sua by Cardinal Newman. The other works of his are of a more intellectual bent. They're thesis-driven, kind of argumentative works. And those three that I would call out for particular attention are, we'll start with the earliest chronologically. That's the Essay on the Development of Christian Doctrine. This is sort of his first major intellectual work post-conversion to the Catholic Church. It's published in 1845. It's sort of, in many ways, it's the crowning achievement of his thought. It's where a lot of his pre-conversion thought leads him, and it's kind of there right at the turning point to his acceptance of the Catholic religion. And we associate with Newman's conversion that great phrase that's often quoted that to be deep in history is to cease to be Protestant, right? What Newman is doing in the development of Christian doctrine is trying to figure out how the continuity of the faith works in doctrinal elucidation, and I'll get a little more into that. But that's one of the chief works, and in many people's reading, perhaps his magnum opus, the Essay on the Development of Christian Doctrine. Don't be fooled by the title. When it's called an essay, it's a big boy. It's a thick book. I think more essay, like a knight essaying forth to go fight a crusade. If a crusade is an essay in that chivalric language, then Newman's development of Christian doctrine is an essay, um, analogously. Another important work that gets a lot of attention, and I think for good reason, and could be studied and perhaps should be studied, especially by academics in the modern world, is his idea of a university. This has a profound influence sort of on our conceptualization of classical education in the modern West. So there's a lot of good food for thought in his idea of the university. Maybe a little more um, niche of a book. You might not find that one as rewarding if you're coming to it with no knowledge of Newman or no interest in higher education and the university system and liberal arts and so forth. Then again, you might. So, but it does deserve calling out as, again, one of these, I think, major milestones in his intellectual journey. The final one that I would call out for particular attention, and this is, in my estimation, the most, well, you know, between the essay on the development of Christian doctrine and this one, for me, it's a dead heat as to which one is more important, influential, and more valuable to read. I lean in favor of this one. It had an impact on me in my own reading when I first discovered it as an undergrad, and I've returned to it again and again. And that is his essay in aid of a grammar of assent. Once again, essay, not what you're thinking. It's a book. And what does this mean? In aid of a grammar of assent. It's really Newman's approach to Christian epistemology and to the relationship between faith and reason, the relationship between reason and revelation, um, the kind of he's approaching phenomenologically, as it were, what it is to assent to something like the faith, which is, yes, it's a series of propositions. You could look at the creedal formulae of how the faith is put forward and what that means to assent to it. But on the other hand, belief, finally, at the end of the day, is really kind of a relationship. It's about trust. It's trusting the truth teller. Again, connection with Chesterton. If you think about the way that Chesterton describes discovering Orthodox Christianity, small o Orthodox Christianity, or the ancient Christian creed, he says, you realize that not only is it a collection of truths, that there's a thing here. It's a truth-telling thing. The historic Christian church, the way that it develops, it it earns your trust, right? So much so that maybe you don't need to work through propositionally every point. At some point, you get to sort of a tipping point where you're willing to assent. A lot of converts have this experience. A lot of reverts have this experience where maybe they struggle with a particular doctrine, whether it be the church's approach to Mary, whether it be the teaching on purgatory, whether it be the church's teaching about the use of hormonal contraception or artificial contraception. In all these cases, or in many of these cases, what the convert eventually feels is something akin to what St. Peter must have felt at the end of the Bread of Life discourse in John chapter 6, where he says, "Lord, to whom else shall we go? You have the words of eternal life." It's not that this wasn't a hard teaching that the Lord had just given. It wasn't that Peter had it all figured out and that he understood from the discourse on the bread of life everything that Jesus meant to propose, though, there. But what Peter did know enough of was that I've seen you work miracles. I've seen you be right all these other times. And so I'm willing to step out in faith here. I'm willing to follow you. I need to follow you because you have the words of eternal life. And I trust that eventually my dim intellect will be enlightened to be able to appreciate all of this. This is, I think, the kind of ultimate way that Newman presents sort of what he calls the grammar of assent, how we assent to the whole kit and caboodle of what is proposed for our belief. And so that's, as I say, for my money, his greatest work. I'm going to talk a little bit more about specific ideas coming out of this, and again, the Chestertonian connections next. I just want to mention 2 honorable mentions here at the end of my list of the major works that you might want to check out. If you're looking more for just edifying things, if you're looking for something that's going to help you in your prayer life, in your faith, then you might want to look at the discourses um, aimed at mixed congregations. I think that's the name of it, but Mixed Congregations Newman, if you just Google that, you'll find it. And then sermons preached on various occasions. And these are sort of both sermons, homilies that Newman would have delivered that have a little bit more of a spiritual or practical bent to them. Those discourses to mixed congregations are a little more still, in the realm of a little bit of polemics and apologetics, but they work in apologetics the way that more popular apologetics do in terms of their appeal, I would argue. And so maybe a little more approachable than these deep theological works, the works that are probably the chief reason for Newman recently being named a doctor of the church. Uh, so to draw some of these parallels that I want to with the remaining time between Newman and Chesterton, we have to step back again and look at the age that Newman is writing in order to appreciate his thought. Uh, I spoke a little bit about it, about what the Victorian world was. One of the places to go, if you're interested in this, is G.K. Chesterton, The Victorian Age in Literature. Not one of his more well-read books, I would argue. Not a lot of people kind of go there. Those that appreciate his novels or maybe his more popular apologetic and kind of semi-autobiographical works like Orthodoxy, The Everlasting Man. The Victorian Age in literature, though, is really an important part of Chesterton's career. It's one of the things that gains him notoriety and clout. He becomes sort of a very significant figure in Dickens studies. He kind of captures Dickens from being dismissed as simply a popular writer and recognizes the importance of Dickens in his era. Chesterton is a great critic, although not formally educated, not belonging to a school, not formally educated, at the university level, and not belonging to a particular school of criticism. He doesn't study the meta craft of what literary criticism is, per se. He's just a really astute and good reader. And those who study literature, even to this day, know that to talk about literature is to talk about the world in which the literature comes about very often. You want to be careful with that, I would argue. The work should be analyzed and read on its own. You don't want to get too much into the, let's say, historical critical kind of study of literature where you're focusing purely on the material conditions. It can lead to all kind of zany interpretations, whether you take a feminist approach or a Marxist approach or whatever it happens to be. So I tend to lean more in the direction of new criticism, where you kind of just focus on the work itself first and foremost. However, inevitably you will, when studying literature in depth, take a look at the surrounding milieu, the circumstances surrounding the publication, the writing and the publication of a work, and then its reception in that society. And so Chesterton, in writing on the Victorian Age in literature, opens up the Victorian Age as such, and it functions simultaneously as a really good literary study and as a really good history of what the Victorian era was all about. As such, Newman gets a few mentions in there, and one of the things that he puts Newman in opposition to in a paradoxical way, as Chesterton is wont to do, um, he puts Newman in opposition to rationalism. But then he also says that Newman was a rationalist. So what does that mean? Well, he's referring to a particular kind of rationalism um, that very much was the case. Think scientism. Um, think of uh, think of the new atheists in our day or more recently. There were these movements back in the 19th century. A lot of the currents that eventually get developed out into 20th century biblical scholarship, for example, trying to look at the archaeological record and demystify, the scriptures and things like that. These are currents that are underway, uh, certainly during Chesterton's time, but also, you could go back into the Victorian era and you can look at this drive sort of to rationalize everything in society from economics, right? So this is when really, economics as a full-fledged study, the way that we know it, comes about. It comes about in the middle of the 19th century. Um, to social relations, you can think of like Darwin's impact. You could think of the way that that becomes a social philosophy. It leads to, in its late periods, it leads to theories like eugenics and kind of institutionalized race theory of the kind that Hitler would eventually espouse. But, there's earlier precursors there like Malthus about the socially fit or unfit. And this is when you have crazes in science like phrenology, like by the study of the shape of someone's skull, you can tell everything about their background, their future, their personality. You could kind of make predictions of their IQ, everything based on, fine measurements of skull, all of which is kind of quack science. But the point is that it's it's an attempt to analyze everything in terms of sort of a kind of rational basis. Well, Newman is opposed to this. Newman, he's not a fideist, right? But he is sort of about faith and reason working in harmony together. And he does sort of want to preserve the element of the need for grace and for faith and for moving uh, sort of not blindly, but moving beyond what you can simply inductively discover from testing and things like that. You have to set first principles. And so Newman is a great defender of sort of defending these essential first principles, not using systematic doubt the way that the scientific method of his era wanted to kind of pull everything apart in order to analyze it, right? Think of that other great line, from Tolkien that he who, takes something apart in order to discover how it works has entered the way of madness, right? Paraphrasing there, but it's something that Gandalf says to Saruman. So this is the rationalism element of the Victorian era, and it's connected, as I said, to thinkers like Darwin. It's also connected to Hegel, the sort of dialectic of history, right? Thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. That what is Hegelianism, but a kind of you're describing now the metaphysics of the universe as such in sort of a logical terminology, a rationalistic terminology. The spirit absolute in Hegel, as it works its way out through this thesis, antithesis, synthesis process, is reflective of this general kind of vibe, this general movement. There's two particular things that Newman goes against, and one he calls out by name, and these are related ideas to what I was mentioning with rationalism. The first is liberalism. He says liberalism is the mistake of subjecting to human judgment those revealed doctrines which are in their nature beyond and independent of human judgment, and of claiming to determine on intrinsic grounds the truth and value of propositions which rest for their reception simply on the external authority of the divine word. So again, against rationalism, this kind of statement that you can't explain away the revealed truth that God is a God of love, let's say, right? You can't tear these things apart, uh, you know, to get down to a rationalistic account of the whole universe. There's always going to be certain things that you accept on first principle sort of basis. So you can't use Descartes, the Cartesian method of systematic doubt all the way down to doubting anything. But I think, therefore I am, or I doubt, therefore I am, right? Newman is sort of impatient towards sort of that sort of approach. And if nothing else, right, in this liberalism, he says liberalism in religion, in particular, is the doctrine that there's no positive truth in religion. One creed is as good as another. Uh, this is the teaching which is gaining substance and force daily, he says. It's inconsistent with any recognition of any religion as true. It teaches that all are to be tolerated, for all are matters of opinion. Revealed religion is not a truth, but a sentiment and a taste, not an objective fact, not miraculous, and it is the right of each individual to make it say just what strikes his fancy. So, liberalism there, sort of akin to relativism, as articulated by people like Pope Benedict XVI, and very, very akin to the way that Chesterton attacks sort of the scientific skepticism of the age. You could think in places like orthodoxy, where he attacks Darwinian or Hegelian thinking patterns in the suicide of thought. He says there is a thought that stops thought, and that is the only thought which ought to be stopped. And there he's talking about sort of this notion of Wells, borrowed from Hegel, of the doubt of the instrument. We don't need to get into all that, but once again, you can see how Chesterton becomes an illumination upon what it is that Newman is driving at if you read these two thinkers in tandem with one another. This tendency of liberalism to kind of pull things apart and break them down to their constituent pieces is destructive to any positive growth in theory and thought. And this is where Newman, just like Chesterton, is a very integral thinker. A lot of his concepts and ideas, his main theses, go hand in hand with one another. So the essay on the grammar of assent, his essay on the development of Christian doctrine, and these attacks that he makes against rationalism and liberalism all are associated ideas. Because one of the points that he's driving at consistently is that you're not going to get anywhere if you're constantly using skepticism as this acid to dissolve everything in. You sort of have to just start building and then let the test, or let the proof be in the pudding, so to speak, right? You can't, if you keep breaking the pudding down to its constituent parts at every step of the baking process, you're never going to have a pudding. So forgive the analogy, but I think that it works, right? You can't build a positive intellectual project, a positive faith or spiritual project, if you're constantly breaking things down to kind of their constituent atoms. And so Newman attacks what I would call primitivism. And this was another movement popular kind of in certain religious movements of the day. And Newman here himself is going to be a little bit paradoxical. Primitivism, he says, this is a very famous quote, "It is indeed sometimes said that the stream is clearest near the spring. Whatever use may fairly be made of this image, it does not apply to the history of a philosophy or belief. Its beginnings are no measure of its capabilities nor of its scope. At first, no one knows what it is or what it is worth. It remains, perhaps for a time, quiescent. It tries, as it were, its limbs and proves the ground under it and feels its way. From time to time, it makes essays which fail and are in consequence abandoned. It seems in suspense which way to go. It wavers, and at length strikes out in one definite direction. In time, it enters upon strange territory. points of controversy alter their bearing. Parties rise and fall around it. Dangers and hopes appear in new relations, and old principles reappear under new forms. It changes with them in order to remain the same. In a higher world, it is otherwise, but here below, to live is to change, and to be perfect is to have changed often. It's a great quote. It gets against this idea of a primitivism that accepts this, what Newman would say is absurd notion that, you know, there's some sort of true kernel of the gospel that was somehow lost and laid dormant for 1,800 years, or 1,600 years, or 1,500 years, and is discovered at some later period in time. The Reformation was one of those claims to sort of discover a primitivism that they wanted to go back to. In his own day, he's fighting against those that want to kind of get rid of all of the growths and what they would call the excrescences of modern faith, whether it be in the Anglican tradition, which was largely grown out of the Catholic tradition, or whether it be in Catholicism, the priests, the incense, the ritualism. And so he was really in it, especially in his early career, he's complaining against the Anglican Church becoming Protestant in that sense. He never viewed himself as a Protestant in that sense. And he was worried by this now claim to primitivism that they were making, to this idea of that by going back to the roots, you're going to discover the thing in its purity, in its purest form. So this is the appeal that he's making, and ironically, I said it's kind of paradoxical because he does then go back and trace from the early days the consistent development and growth in the development of Christian doctrine, and so it's a great Catholic both and, that you want to preserve the roots, but you don't preserve them and then cut off all the growth. You have to understand the roots and appreciate them in light of what grew thereafter. And this is one of kind of his revolutionary approaches that I think is, once again, very resonant of Chesterton. That quotation about the stream, and then how this thing grows, and how he says it enters upon strange territory, points of controversy alter their bearing, parties rise and fall around it, dangers and hopes appear in new relations, old principles reappear under new forms. It reminds one so powerfully of the great passage, I think it's in the Romance of Orthodoxy, where Chesterton describes the church as the chariot thundering down through the ages with the heresies sprawling before it, and the wild truth reeling but erect, right? This great adventure of orthodoxy that Chesterton describes, and how it avoids, as it goes through the ages, all of these various things. And how does it do that? How does it avoid these heresies on either side? It does it precisely through the process of articulation and development of doctrine, by unfolding what was already there, what is growing organically up out of those roots, but needs now new articulation in order to counter the new faddish thought of the day. Everything from Albigensianism, Arianism, to Albigensianism, to Calvinism, let's say. So you could read very much, an essay on the development of Christian doctrine in parallel with, some of those passages in Orthodoxy, and I think really see, if not a positive influence that Newman is having upon Chesterton, at least that they are two thinkers very much cut from the same cloth. I hesitate to say that there's so much of an influence, because while I do acknowledge that Chesterton certainly read and appreciated Newman, he also sort of differentiates himself from Newman. He he says in one place that Newman was a bit of a snob. He didn't appreciate the Irish the way that Chesterton thinks that they ought to be appreciated. In a certain way, Newman to Chesterton, maybe you could say, was sort of British, not English. He was a man of his age in that way, and had some of the snobbery and the contempt for continental religion and and the Irish faith. Newman, even in the Apologia Pro Vita Sua, you'll see he struggles with this, and he's, I think, still uncomfortable even as an early Catholic with some of the church's allowances in terms of the cult of saints and the feast days and those sort of what we think of the Latin expressions of Catholicism. And Chesterton loved that stuff. Chesterton loved the pageantry and the accretion of legend up, from the culture. Chesterton, I think, uh, in that sense, was a man more of a sympathy with the poor and their rude customs, and in that way, a bigger cardinal influence on Chesterton, if you want to go to cardinals of the church, is probably Cardinal Manning. Cardinal Manning, which in Chesterton's youth was the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster, and or I think it was at Westminster, but in any case, he was the labor movement kind of leader. He's influential and inspiring, even of Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum, and the way that he negotiates dock strikers, and owners coming together to the table. So Manning's sort of solicitude for the poor, his down-to-earth nature, this was something that did motivate Chesterton and appeal to Chesterton. I already mentioned Leo XIII. Obviously, that movement drives Chesterton. So when you look at Chesterton's conversion and Chesterton's growth into the faith, he's not like an Oxford movement Catholic. He's not somebody who's drawn into it by reading, let's say, arguments such as those that Newman was putting forward, but rather he comes there a little more organically. And yet, again, ironically, paradoxically, that does sort of make him more akin to Newman than I think either of those men, if they knew each other, would have admitted or or been willing to acknowledge. I'll say one final thing about Newman. Already probably yammered at you too long here, but this has to do with what Newman calls the illative sense. Can't say much about this at all this late in this episode, but I do want to just put a pin in that. And if you're an aspiring Chesterton scholar out there, or you want to write a paper, you want to do some research on Chesterton, this is a fruitful avenue. There has been some research already published on it in various magazines and journals. However, more definitely deserves to be said about the similarity of Chesterton's epistemology, his epistemological approach to reasoning about the faith, and Newman's approach, as he describes in the Grammar of Assent, this thing called the illative sense, where the illative sense is kind of a growth of probabilistic reasoning. Again, remember how I said that all of Newman's thought is sort of tied together. So what we were describing before about how at every stage you can't just keep breaking things down, you can't inquire. Newman sort of describes the way that we come to assent, the way that we come to grasp and give assent to propositions of the faith. Isn't this strictly being motivated by premises followed by conclusions? It's more of a vibe, if you will. It's being struck by beauty. It's being struck by symmetry and aptness, how the thing just fits together. Being struck at some point finally by the truth telling quality, by the trustworthiness of the witness. He says we can't even know it ourselves, right? How all of these tumblers in the lock fall together in our mind to finally drive us over the edge. And so he'll famously say that 10,000 difficulties don't equal one doubt. He says doubt, that's a positive rejection, a positive conclusion based on, I've cut apart these premises and one of them doesn't work. I found a weakness or whatever. He said there's going to be difficulties along the way. You're going to wonder, how does this thing fit in? How does this other thing fit in? But through this process, guided by what he would call the illative sense, eventually you sort of start to kind of just trust that, yeah, it's gonna work. It's gonna all come together in the end. It's the baking of that pudding. It's the putting of this thing together. And this very much is a Chestertonian way of approach. Think of the maniac in Orthodoxy, where Chesterton says, if you're reasoning with the madman who believes that everyone is in a conspiracy against him, his logic might be sound. It's just a small circle of logic, but yet, like a circle, it is complete. The only way to approach this is to break him out of the circle, to basically say, well, okay, maybe it were the case, but wouldn't you rather just live in a larger world where you're if you are the king of England, as you say, and everybody's in a conspiracy to keep you from being on the throne, then you'd probably be happier just to abdicate and go on with your life, right? You make an appeal to the sentiment there. You're not necessarily breaking through the logic of a madman because you can't. So Chesterton, I would argue, in Orthodoxy and the Maniac in particular, is sort of in tune with this notion of the illative sense as Newman describes it. And so I think this is another great point of contact between this doctor of the church and this great 20th century writer that deserves future study. Said a lot of words here. This was a bit of a free-flowing video essay on a great thinker who defies summation. He is a doctor of the church. There's much more to be said about him. There's much that can be said more accurately than I have said it. I encourage you to check out the Word on Fire Institute's course it's a 10-part lecture series by Bishop Robert Barron on Cardinal Newman. That will give you a bit more detail than I was able to offer here. And you can subscribe to the Word on Fire podcast, and they're actually releasing that in honor of Newman being named a doctor of the church. They're releasing that episode by episode on that podcast as a free series. I'll try to link to that in the show notes so that you can check that out. Hopefully this was somewhat helpful to you. Hopefully it inspires you to go try to pick something up by Newman and grapple with it. It is a bit of grappling. As I say, he is very much a Victorian writer, and yet I find him very rewarding and enjoyable to read, especially when you balance your reading of him with reading of Chesterton, to see where they overlap, where they diverge, where they cast light upon the minds of one another. Until next time, again, Joe Grabowski for Uncommon Sense. Please do leave us a comment, tell us what you thought about this episode, share with your friends, subscribe so that you get live updates as to all our future podcasts, and I will talk to you again soon. God bless.